And before we get started here, it is important, of course, to acknowledge our traditional lands. And at Railroads University, we acknowledge our lands are located on the lands of the Lekwungen people, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And it is with gratitude where we learn and work here, where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, staff, and faculty come together. So delighted to be with all of you here today. And of course, we're all tuning in today for part 2 of Managing Environmental Conflicts for Sustainable Peace. My name is Ariana Konjerski. I am in student recruitment at Railroads University, and I'm always delighted to be joined by such brilliant people here. I'm joined by Dr. Kenneth Christie, who's the director of the School of Humanitarian Studies and the program head for our Masters of Arts in Human Security and Peace Building. Ken, it's nice to see you again.
Hi, nice to see you too, Ariane.
Fantastic. And we're also joined by David A. Carten, who's an associate faculty here at Railroads, and I'll let Ken introduce him in just a moment. But with that, I believe I am all done speaking here, so I'll stop sharing my screen. And Ken, I'll leave it to you to introduce David.
Thanks very much, Ariana. And as Ariana said, I'm a professor in the Human Security and Peace Building Studies program. I'm actually the program head for that. So this material is extremely relevant, and we hope that people do get something out of the content and are encouraged to apply to the program if they find that interesting. And we'll be going over the details of the program. But David Carten joins us today. He's a wonderful scholar practitioner of environmental conflict management. His work is at the very nexus of culture, risk, and environment, where he designs strategies, structures, and financial instruments that will uphold and align Indigenous rights and interests with project objectives and goals, while creating sustainable generational wealth for communities. And David also works in the development of very socially sophisticated technology-driven processes in conflict prevention, and that enables collaboration across and between stakeholders for major projects seeking Indigenous inputs. And today what we're going to try and do is look at the sort of human security and peace building aspects of this as it reflects in the kind of content of the material. And this is really interesting and important, I think, because we have so many conflicts that are now developing that are based in the environment, with climate change, with global warming, and of course with resource management, because of all the conflicts based around the politics of resources and the allocation of resources. So this is a hugely important topic for us. It's reflected in the program, and we're delighted to have David. David also works in the Human Security and Peace Building program, as well as across other programs within Railroads. So if you did decide to come to Railroads and take one of these programs, you probably have David as a professor within the school. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David. He's going to do about a 25 to 30-minute presentation. And then I'm going to ask David a few questions. And then what we would like to do is, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box with your name attached, and we will save them for later. Or otherwise, if you want to directly ask questions after the presentation, that would be fine too. But we won't have questions until after the presentation. But thanks very much, David, for joining us. And, I hope this research, which is so important, has a resonance within this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and I'm very happy to see some familiar names from yesterday. I'll get going by sharing my screen, which will be right here. Excuse me. Slideshow. Okay. Managing environmental conflict for sustainable peace. I would also like to acknowledge that, sorry, I'm just getting this slide sorted out, that I live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish nations of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I stuck this slide in just as in case anybody missed the email yesterday. who was here yesterday, or if we have any new viewers, this was part 1. And there's the YouTube link down at the bottom to the presentation from yesterday. It was a considerably longer presentation than today, and was really looking from 30,000 feet up as to what environmental conflict and the drivers of environmental conflict, what these are, and then zooming in to some aspects of a case study here in British Columbia, which is the Coastal GasLink and Wet'suwet'en conflict, Coastal GasLink pipeline. So that's available for anybody, and these two parts, part 1 and part 2, are meant to work together. As scholar practitioners in the field of conflict resolution, we seek to bridge the gap between research and theory on cooperation and conflict, and the challenges of managing and resolving conflict faced by practitioners. We use evidence-based knowledge to influence social issues and improve quality of life, and apply the experiential knowledge of practitioners to informing new research and theory development. The theory of practice is for understanding and influencing conflict. And what I'm showing you here are 2 of my colleagues from Columbia University. And Dr. Peter Coleman is a social psychologist, and Dr. Josh Fisher is a research scientist, but he is an environmental professional. And so that is the spectrum on which and within which we work in environmental conflict management. And these are resources that I draw upon quite heavily in my course. Josh has come to speak to some of my courses, and so and is always open to speak to my classes. So it's very likely that you'll get him in the course. And the reason why this is a spectrum is this, and this is what I'm going to be exploring a bit today, is looking at conflict analysis and how we undertake this. And so when we look at these issues, these conflicts, they're levels of analysis, frames in how we need to be thinking across the entire spectrum of the practice. And so levels of analysis refer to specific types of agents or phenomena whose actions are deemed to be the cause of other phenomenon. And the levels of analysis range from the most macroscopic social forces, like the entire international system, to the most microscopic, like the cognitive processes of individual leaders, such that in theory, there are an infinite number of levels of analysis. And so a lot of the practice is analysis, and then gleaning from the analysis the influences and elements of the conflict, so that you can find ways in which you can influence it. So here is an introductory slide to what I'm going to show you. As our world becomes increasingly more complex and interconnected, it's also becoming much more volatile and unpredictable. And so our standard, or what we would say default models and methods for conflict resolution, are particularly challenged. This is because complexity tends to drive us to becoming more simplistic in our thinking, feeling, and acting. And this is actually a neurological tendency. It's called the cognitive miser. So when your mind is presented with something that is overly complex, it automatically tends to move to try to simplify it, and that basically inhibits anybody from thinking strategically. And so what we do is we apply tools and methods and frameworks for being able to navigate this and act strategically and deliberately. So this is one of the social psychological models of analysis, this example. So this model considers conflict interactions in the context of social relations, employing fundamental dimensions such as power and interdependence, which I touched on yesterday, for creating a basic framework to investigate conflict dynamics at the social psychological level. So that would be between individuals. Tools like this are meant to give us a baseline understanding of conflict, of a conflict situation, which in turn enables more deliberate and strategic approaches. So another tool, and this is sort of going to another level, say 10,000 feet up, we get into conflict mapping. And these are and visualizations, and I should say data visualizations form a very big part of my course. So the conflict map is at the community level. And what we're looking to do is to refer to geospatial, temporal, or relational aspects of the conflict that integrate risk, stakeholder context, and conflict analysis. And so that everybody that you're working with is on the same page, as it were, and that you have an understanding of who and the actors and dynamics are with the situation that you're dealing with. This is a tool that I use a lot. This is action oriented network analysis. So this is social networks. Social networks analysis helps us analyze, organize, and visualize complex networks and the relationships between insiders and outsiders. Network tools can also help identify powerful nodes and edges in networks, including spoilers, so that you can foster a collaborative ecosystem based on power and dynamics. And what these maps do is, and social network science is quite elaborate, but it's looking at how people or organizations influence other people and organizations within a social network. And I use this extensively in my own work, and it's a big part of my course. The next level would be systems mapping. And so one of the fundamental features of a system is the interconnectedness of the different elements and the dynamic relationships among the different parts of that system. So in systems mapping, which I also teach in the course, it's a means through which to understand patterns of causality and to identify feedback loops and attractor processes. And really, the ability to identify patterns is incredibly important, because it allows you to figure out where you might be entering into a system and what kinds of interventions you would take in order to change the system in the direction in which you want to go. And this, again, as I mentioned yesterday, this is founded in the theoretical concepts of complexity theory and systems dynamics, and then this is another tool that I use, which is looking at, and this is very specific to environmental conflict. These are complex adaptive cycles. A complex adaptive cycle serves as a heuristic tool to understand how change impacts resource availability and the rigidity of the emergent order in a system. The results of the conflict analysis process can be mapped to a complex adaptive cycle to describe major conflict dynamics of the system, as well as identify entry points for initiating systems change. And that's because in a complex dynamic system, we tend to work in a pattern. And what happens is when there's a disturbance in the cycle, things will reorganize, and they will either reorganize as it was, or they will reorganize in a different manifestation. And this is the same in nature as it is in human nature. And so we look for those points of reorganization, and that would be the kind of an entry point for an environmental conflict. These are tools that I use in my own work, and these are data-driven geospatial mapping. Data-driven analytics can rapidly communicate complex political, social, environmental, and historical dynamics to stakeholders. Interactive maps are accessible both to high-level decision makers and the wider public at large, shaping narratives and storytelling. AI-enabled maps, digital twins, storyboards, and listening tools can also be used to help facilitate processes of dialogue and negotiation, including sensitive topics, to develop shared understanding. These kinds of visualizations are really an excellent way to get everybody on the same page. And of course, with data, you're layering all kinds of different data. And when you're in the digital space, you're able to add layers and to track layers from the space to see different things. Interactive data analytics. These form part of one of the case studies in my course, which deals with the Yanomami and illegal mining in the Amazon. I work with a colleague of mine from the Igarape Institute, a man named Dr. Robert Mugga, who's designing these kinds of interactive platforms. These kinds of tools can visualize 50 to 100 metrics to highlight demographic, environmental, urbanization related trends. And you can zoom in and out to generate charts, consult automatic data sheets. And so what you do is you learn how to use these and apply them in your analysis and in my course. Storyboards we use, which are feature a series of nested and graphic articles on key thematic and geographic dynamics. The stories are typically short, 500 to 1,000 words, interspersed with maps and images to help better understand ground realities. Storyboards can be aligned with data visualizations and interactive data analytics to drive home key messages, including for the public and media. Moving along here, I'm coming to this is an aspect that's very specific, and I touched on this yesterday, which are collaborative governance regimes. I look at these specifically here in British Columbia because of the very complex multi-jurisdictional, multi-stakeholder environment that we're in. The case that I touched on yesterday, which was the Coastal GasLink pipeline and the Wet'suwet'en, is an excellent example of that. And so when you're in when the institutions aren't serving the needs, and I mentioned this yesterday, of people, then people will redefine the rules and structures that govern that. And collaborative governance regimes are meant as a very flexible architecture for which you can do that, particularly in multi-jurisdictional, multi-stakeholder settings. And so this is something that we dive in deeply. The book, I've referenced the book here. It's one of the core textbooks in my course. And that is basically the end of my presentation today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can here and open it up for questions based on our presentation from yesterday and today. And away we go.
Thanks, David. That was a really great overview of that. So could you maybe dwell a little bit more on the sort of human security aspects of this? This is, give us a sort of practical example within your research of how this affects human security in terms of its sort of theoretical underpinnings or its practical underpinnings,
Well, so for example, geospatial data-driven mapping, I mean, one of the reasons why we look at this is because we look to layer all of the different interests that are in a specific territory. So if you were to take any given Indigenous territory here in British Columbia, you have an industrial proponent that wants to develop a large project, be it a mine or a pipeline. You have those are interests that they have that are very specific and driven by very specific goals, but they cross over all kinds of other interests. Like, for example, Indigenous nations have interests in terms of cultural sites, ecological sites, medicines, etc. And so finding where those points intersect is a means through which to get everybody on the same page. Then you have the social aspects, which can be very complex. I think I showed a social network map yesterday of that Wet'suwet'en conflict. I have social network maps now for other pipelines in the province, but because there for example, on any given pipeline, there are probably 20 to 30 different First Nations, and each one of those First Nations is within an Indigenous national territory. And so you might have multiple different First Nations with multiple elected band councils that are within an Indigenous national territory that is then governed under a different regime. That is, these are the ancient regimes that have existed for a long time that are based on clan and house. And so you end up with a lot of people, and being able to understand who is who and how they're connected to everybody else and where the points of influence might be. It also is a tool in which you can understand very well who you should be trying to speak with, and so that you can then design interventions that are going to be meaningful. So whether that's mediation or change process design, for bringing people together into a room to work through some of these issues. Because if you're not doing that and you're ignoring them, then you end up with the conflicts. And so a lot of this stuff is, it's, when I look at these projects, I don't, there's part of this is which conflict resolution. Okay, so something blows up, then you're really in that sort of resolution mode. But one of the things that I'm working with and that I teach in my courses now, early warning systems and conflict prevention, and how we can use technology to design conflict prevention programs so that things don't get out of hand. And a lot of these tools do that. And the visualization tools, I think, are probably the most compelling. And that's because, as I mentioned yesterday, any project in British Columbia has to go through an environmental assessment. And if you ever read any one of these environmental assessment reports, and I mean, it would take you quite a long time, because they're normally hundreds and hundreds of pages long. It's very difficult to link these things in a static and one-dimensional environment like a piece of paper. And so these kinds of tools make it a lot easier and much more accessible for people to access and to get people on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, human security is about the protection of vulnerable individuals, right? So could you give me an example of how these individuals that are involved here are vulnerable? What kinds of vulnerability? Is it cultural vulnerability, for instance? Is it resource vulnerability? Is it actual what's happening to the lives of the people on the ground? I mean, we've had a lot of this big macro kind of theory, but what is actually happening on the ground? How do they feel threatened in some ways by what's going on?
So this depends. Obviously, it's very contextual, and that's really important. Is context within everything needs to be considered within its context. For example, with the Yanomami and illegal mining in the Amazon, which is one of the cases that we study, miners are not bad. I mean, people have to earn a living. Okay, and so they may be mining illegally, but they don't see themselves as being bad people. But what happens is you end up with bad actors that do enter, because there are networks that operate to buy and sell gold, that are the same networks that may be operating to buy and sell arms, to buy and sell narcotics and things like that. And so the security of the people who live within the areas of those networks, they become vulnerable in that way. And in other ways, such as deregulated markets like that, that cyanide enters the water, and so people's health is at risk. But it's a very systemic problem, and it's highly complex. And so being able to use these tools to understand it, and the Igarape Institute, with whom I work, is one of my colleagues. They do a lot of this stuff within the context of, say, the other case study that we use is a local case study, because British Columbia is an environment that there's a lot of environmental conflict here. Within the vulnerabilities here are complex. And so you have, beginning with the structural violence of the Indian Act and what that did to First Nations and Indigenous peoples in this country, is, essentially trapping them into poverty on these very small plots of reserve land. And so these projects really amplify these issues, because what you see here in British Columbia is that, LNG is for, potentially lifting people out of poverty. But, it's important to really dig into the details on that and understand the data, right? I mean, well, what is poverty? What is the poverty level of British Columbia? What is the average income of an individual on reserve in British Columbia? What is the unemployment rate of a person in British Columbia? And so and how far, what's the gap? Because the proposition is always that, well, these projects are gonna improve your lives, but people disagree about that. And so you know, that's why you really need the data and having data-driven analysis for understanding all of the, you know, we use something which is an iceberg analogy, an iceberg tool where you have your issues that are sort of on the surface, but then below that is a whole swath of other issues that are directly related to the security of people, and which are what divide them and put them into conflict with each other. And these are communities that are in conflict with each other. It's not just some pan-Indigenous group that's always against a pipeline. It's not like that. It's far more complex.
Okay. Thanks so much, David. We have a question in the chat box I'd like to move on to. It's quite an interesting question from Eloise. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. But the question is geomapping and data sovereignty. How do you get access to that data or permissions when you're mapping these interests, ecosites, etc.? And what considerations do you take to protect this data and share it?
So the data maps that we use in my course, and all of the examples that we're using in my course are produced in and the social network maps are different, but we use open source intelligence for the most part. The data maps in that we use in the course are coming from the Igarape Institute, which is in the Amazon, and so they're following procedures and protocols that are relevant to those areas. I know data sovereignty in British Columbia is a very, very prescient topic. And so that, and the rules around research with First Nations are very, very stringent. And so you always have to follow those kinds of protocols. There's no, unless you're dealing with open source intelligence. And so open source intelligence is often as a first foray into any given issue. It's open source, and there's a lot that you can gather with open source intelligence.
Thanks very much. Are there any other questions in the chat box, or if anyone would like to ask a question, you could maybe raise your hand or something, and we'll give you access to the floor if you like, and you can actually ask your own question. That would be great. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. If not, we'll move on to a kind of what we do in the program a little bit and how to apply for the program.
I should note, just to follow on that question, within the confines of my course, students are not allowed to reach out to First Nations or Indigenous nations or anybody that's in the field. I mean, that's something that they cannot do. And just to reinforce it, this is within the confines of the course. It's open source intelligence only.
What would you say, David, is the main issue then? You've talked about a lot of these conflicts, environmental conflicts, but these are quite large general conflicts. How specific? I mean, it seems to me Indigenous people are always talking about their land and the right to that land and the treaties that were created within Canada around that land and property, etc. So when you're talking to the Indigenous people in these communities, when you're talking to the elders and the leaders, what is first on their mind? If they were to define the conflict, how would they define the conflict?
Well, that's a very complex question. For example, with the Wet'suwet'en and Coastal GasLink, those communities were divided. The Wet'suwet'en are not just a homogeneous group. There are different clans, there are different houses, there are different First Nations, and they have different interests and are driven by different things. And so that pipeline was very much an intra-community conflict. And so it would depend on who you're talking to and what they believe and what their interests are. So I spent, for example, I chaired a roundtable at the International Association of Conflict Management with the highest ranking chief of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, and his, for example, and when you say land, you're in this case, you're absolutely right. His deepest fear, in my opinion, was that the pipeline, and that the fact that the permitting of the pipeline had basically gone through because they had the support of the different elected band councils that were within that traditional territory, that the support would damage hit the Aboriginal title to the land. Okay, and so Aboriginal title is a very specific feature of Aboriginal rights in Canada, constitutional rights. So you have Section 35, which is Aboriginal rights, and then within those rights is what's known as Aboriginal title. And Aboriginal title is like fee simple title, somewhere between fee simple and sovereignty in Canada. There are two nations in British Columbia that have achieved that. That's the Tsilhqot'in in 2014, and then just this year the Haida, which was a negotiated agreement. However, the very first Aboriginal title case that went to the Supreme Court of Canada was the Gitxsan and the Wet'suwet'en, and that essentially defined that court proceeding defined how the Constitution considers Aboriginal title. And so his main concern was, are those agreements damaging the title, and have they created a title-free corridor through the territory? And so, and the fear with a title-free corridor through the territory is that, well, in this case, we've got LNG. Maybe people, they think LNG is not as necessarily as bad as heavy oil. But what happens if a new government that's not an NDP government is in power and is in favor of heavy oil? Perhaps they will be running a heavy oil pipeline through the territory. And and I think that's actually a really good example of the kinds of open source intelligence that's out there that you can access. There's the Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan through that court proceeding. This was through the British Columbia Supreme Court before it went to the Supreme Court of Canada. But it was a proceeding. It's called Delgamuukw versus British Columbia. It went on for years, and it was the very first time that oral histories were permitted as evidence in the court. And so what they did over the course of the proceeding was through the oral histories, and which include songs, etc. They were basically describing the territory, so they would be able to describe the claim, right? That yes, we've been here for thousands of years, and this is why we know that. And those transcripts are available at University of British Columbia. It's a 60-volume set of the entire court proceeding. And so one of the environmental assessment, I did an environmental assessment in the Wet'suwet'en territory during this conflict, which was for a large mine. And I used those transcripts. It was the very first time anybody had used them for an environmental assessment in the territory. They've been, my colleagues have been up there for 20 years. But when we went in to use them, it was exceptionally it enabled us to achieve the goals that we had. And one of the goals, which was to uphold the Wet'suwet'en right of title. And I don't want to get in too deeply into the details of that here, because I can go on and on and on about this, but through those transcripts and then of course taking what we learned from the transcripts and then looking for other evidence of things outside of the transcripts, because it was mentioned in the transfer, a totem pole, for example. There was a totem pole mentioned in the transcript. That means that they were enacting governance. So the totem pole doesn't exist at the mine site anymore. So we went out and found a photo of the totem pole. And so then, what you're doing is then creating arguments around the continuity of governance over the land, which is their connection to the land, etc. So that's the land. On the other side, you've got the economic interest. And so the poverty in just to give you this statistic, it's up in northern British Columbia, the average income of an individual Indigenous is $13,000 a year. Okay, or $15,000 a year. Okay, that's these, and so that is, I mean, you can imagine that's it is a level of poverty that is about the poorest in the world. And so when these projects come through and there's money that's put on the table, it creates, because there's need, people become conflicted. And, some people will just say, yes, well, I have to take the money. I have obligations to my constituents if I'm an elected band councillor. And so, what am I supposed to do? Because what people don't understand is that people tear up floorboards to heat the homes. Okay. And that's a reality. And it's something that Canadians by and large have not, or they're waking up to now, I think. But so those issues become very stark, and that's why these communities become very divided. Because, for example, the hereditary chief that I was with is a very conservative guy, but a very conservative guy in an Indigenous sense. Okay, so he's not, like a conservative on the political spectrum the way you'd like to think about it. He's conservative in terms of the traditions and values and processes and governance of these territories, and that these sort of colonial constructs that have been created around that are illegitimate. So that's a short answer.
That's the bigger argument. I mean, that this is the kind of colonial process has created these structures, which then bring the indigenous population, who have always had their own kind of structures and governance structures, into conflict with them. So it's a conflict over governance, it's a conflict over sovereignty, it's a conflict over land, right? There's many different types of conflict here. And getting at that environmental conflict, because I mean, the environment can mean all of these kinds of things. It can mean the social environment, it can mean the economic environment, it could mean the kind of environment all around you in nature, right? And what's happening with that. So that's the complexity. I have to say one thing though, that when students are doing their research on Indigenous peoples, and I'm sure that you know exactly the same, having done that, there's a very, very strict ethical review process that has to be undergone in order to interview Indigenous people, as there is with many other, for instance, if you're interviewing children, for instance, or you're interviewing people with some people with a criminal background, you have to fill all these forms in to get that ethical review done, which can hold up research quite a bit. But fascinating research. Do we have any other questions coming from the audience, or is there anything that anyone's really burning to learn here? And if not, I think we'll go ahead with some of the program information.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ken and David. That was super, super interesting. So we appreciate that very much. I'll go ahead and put up the slides just for our program information. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions, feel free, of course, pop them in the chat or raise your hand and I can unmute you as well. So let me just pop these on the screen here. Perfect. So of course, if you want to know more about human security and peace building, we have just a few slides here, which Ken will take us through, and then I will detail a little bit of information on how to apply. So if you're thinking of applying for our human security and peace building program, of course, we would love to have you. And here's the first slide, Ken. I'll pass it off to you.
So people are always saying to me, "Oh, why would I want to do human security and peace building?" These are terms that are not commonly referenced in not ordinary day language. Well, I think one of the things about human security and peace building is we're trying to respond, or we're trying to react to the increasing demand for leadership in humanitarian assistance and social construction, conflict management, and peace building in international context. We do work in the domestic context. I mean, if students wanted to come in and do projects in Canada, the project that, for instance, that David is talking about is highly relevant, for instance, amongst Indigenous conflict with colonial structures within Canada, etc. We have a lot of leeway there. But we also have a lot of students who come in and they say, "Oh, I want to go to Africa, I want to go to Asia, I want to go to Latin America, I want to do work with the United Nations or an international NGO. I want to make a change in those countries, and they have that kind of heady rush of idealism, if you like, and that's great, you know, because a lot of students go on to do that. We have students working all over the world, from Colombia to Poland to Asia and Africa, and every single place in the world we have students just about and doing these incredible jobs. One of our top students from years ago, Stephanie Perham, is very senior in the UNHCR, which has helped to put back hundreds of thousands of displaced people from northern Uganda who had to flee into Sudan with the Ugandan wars in the 1990s, and helped to relocate them back into their home because she created a system of GIS mapping in the United Nations, which allowed people to do that. It's incredible work like this, you know, that we don't often hear about. You know, the news concentrates on all the negative consequences of conflict and war, but we have these incredible success stories on the other hand that are actually going on a day-to-day basis. And so we have a lot of students in that. So we view peace building as a kind of a broad concept which looks at social transformation and integrating short-term development initiatives into long-term sustainable peace processes. And you know, in 2015, one of the instructors in the course that I hired into the program, Rob Hanlon, and I wrote a book on this, which was published by University of Toronto Press. It's called Freedom from Fear, Freedom from Want, and it essentially views human security as part of two processes. One is freedom from fear, that is individuals' fear for their life, fear for persecution, fear from political violence on all sorts of levels, and why people flee. Like, for instance, people during the Syrian civil war, etc., or wars in Africa, for instance, which have created all this mass displacement of people, refugees, migrants, etc. And of course, the other side to that is a broader concept which looks at freedom from want. You know, how do we allocate resources, economic resources, social resources properly to people who are in poverty, for instance, so that they are no longer in these sort of shackles of not being able to feed themselves or not being able to live a decent, sustainable life within their own context. So, freedom from want is an extremely important aspect of the program also. So we talk about development, we talk about political development, social development, economic development in these areas, you know, and David touched on all of these aspects today within his discussion, within his talk about the indigenous rights, for instance, and the land, for instance, which is so important. Not only that, but it's also about cultural dignity. How do I preserve my cultural dignity in the face of these forces of globalization and you know, this attempt to homogenize people into one big amorphous kind of block where they don't have their own identity anymore, or they lose their identity within that. So we talk about resistance to that, you know, and how people resist and why they resist in these efforts, and how we can look at that. So I think maybe the next slide, Ariana. So in terms of the human security and peace building programs, and as I say, I've been the program head for human security and peace building ever since I came to Royal Roads in 2009. So this is my 15th year doing this, you know, and I've not been fired yet, which is amazing, you know. Uh, we have a 2-year program of about 36 credits in the program. We have an online program with 3 residency. We have 2 mandatory 2-week residencies, which means you do a 2-week residency in your first year and a 2-week residency in your second year. And we have an optional 1-week residency somewhere in between that. We also offer a graduate diploma. That's just 1 year, and that's 18 credits, so half the program, if you like. That's online, again, with 1 residency, 1 mandatory 2-week residency in the first year. So you only need to do one year. Now, the interesting thing is, if you take the graduate diploma and you say, oh, you know, I don't have time to do the master's program, but you're really enjoying the graduate diploma, and you get to the end of the graduate diploma and say, well, I'd like to actually do the master's. That would only be another year if you wanted to do that and try that out. And that would be, you know, a nice way if you didn't feel like committing to a full master's degree, then you could start with the graduate and then you could move on to the master's. And of course, everything you'd done within your 1 year, your 18 credits, would just be transferred into your master's degree, and you'd only have 1 year to go. Well, thanks. Maybe the next slide. Yeah. So that's the start dates for next year. The master's degree and the graduate diploma in human security and peace building. We start on January 13th, 2025, and the application deadline is October 13th, 2024. So probably just under 2 months, or just over 2 months, sorry, to go to get that application in. Yeah, next slide, I think. So how to apply? There's an online application. It's $134.01. I have no idea why there's a 1 cent in there, which is very, very strange, but that's, I'm not in charge of collecting the money, but that's the fee for it. And then we have supporting documents. You need official transcripts. If you've done your bachelor's degree, for instance, at a college or another university, we will need the official transcripts from there, a detailed resume, a personal statement. Why do you want to join this? Why do you want to actually do this master's degree? You know, what are your interests in doing a master's degree in human security and peace building? And you will need 2 letters of reference. Now, the good thing is, I don't know if this is on the next slide, but there is several ways to apply. For instance, if you have done a bachelor's degree already, and you've maintained a pretty good GPA of, say, a B+, then you're pretty much assured of getting into the program, right? But if you have not got a first degree, if you have not got a bachelor's degree, you can still get into the program. And the reason is we value the fact that people have very heavy schedules in the humanitarian world. I've had students who've been working for the United Nations for 30 years. They say, oh, I haven't never had time to take a degree. I'd love to take a degree. And say, well, you're available for a flexible assessment then if you have about 10 years of work in an organization which we qualify as doing some sort of humanitarian work, then we can take you into the program, right? And I'm very supportive of that because some of the best students, they also come from backgrounds where there's a practical aspect. You know, of a student say, well, I've worked in Africa for 30 years, you know, I don't have a first degree, I don't have a bachelor's degree, how can I get in the program? And I'll say, you know, apply. Because if you've done all that work, that amazing work at that level, then you probably either deserve to be in the program or you have the skills, and you will know a lot about what we're already going to discuss. But you'll be getting a degree at the end of it, and it'll be helping you in your career. And as I say, we've had a lot of students. So I work for the United Nations. I don't have a degree, but you know, I would like to take a degree because I know it will help me get up the ladder a bit higher or apply for a promotion or, you know, boost my educational capacity so that people can see that. And I think that's really important to think about. So again, maybe Ariana could talk a little bit about the services. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken. Thank you again, David. It's wonderful. I appreciate the program information as well. Of course, at Royal Roads, we know going to any program is a really big step. So we have some services that are available to you if you're looking to take the next step. We have financial aid and award services that are available. So if you're looking for things like loans, bursaries, scholarships, or other awards, as well as funding and emergency funding, because life happens sometimes. You can check that out at royalroads.ca/admission/financial aid awards, and all of this will be in my follow-ups as well. You can also reach out to our enrollment services folks at learn.more@royalroads.ca. And then if you prefer a phone call, there's also some phone numbers there on the screen for local and toll-free in North America as well. And they can really help you narrow down your program options and connect you with students and alumni. So if you're looking to speak with folks that have been through the Human Security and Peace Building program, I can set you up with that as well. And with that, that is our last slide here for today. I just want to say thank you so much again to Ken and David. Such a wonderful presentation and a lot of wonderful information that have been shared over both parts. So we really appreciate it. And to all of you live and on the recording, we appreciate your time and thank you so much for tuning in. Of course, we hope to see you in the program soon. But at this point, Ken, I just want to pass it quickly back off to you to wrap us up if you have any last words here.
Yeah, again, thanks so much to everyone for tuning in, and thanks for your participation. It's really important. At Royal Roads, we really emphasize teamwork, you know, during the courses. So you'll be working in teams just as you will be in the real world if you work in the world of humanitarianism. Very rarely do people work alone. They work in groups, they work in teams to achieve projects and do this kind of really important and valuable work. And, you know, you just have to switch on the news to see that this kind of work, this humanitarian work, is never ending. You know, whether we're talking about the war in Russia and the Ukraine, or what's happening in Gaza right now, or what's happening in many other parts of the world, domestically and internationally. So there's no end to these kinds of problems. We hope that through this work we can come to some sort of resolution. We hope that we can do more than manage these conflicts, that we can actually change and transform the conflict into peaceful solutions. And sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think that the effort that people make in trying to achieve this is an amazing thing. And we've had, as I say, amazing students over the years. You won't get rich doing this kind of work, you know. It's not something for people who want to be extremely wealthy, but it is for people who, you know, can go to bed easily at night with their conscience because they've done something really, really valuable for the world. So thank you for coming along, and thank you to Ariana who put much of this together. Thank you to David for sticking in there for the second part of the process, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.